morning sun crept over the eastern ridge of Mount Blackpeak, casting long shadows across Elijah Thorne's weathered cabin. At 67, Elijah had spent the better part of 3 decades on this mountain, far from the chaos of civilization. His calloused hands worked methodically, skinning the rabbit he'd caught in one of his traps. The familiar ritual brought him comfort, a small reminder that some things remained constant in his carefully constructed world of solitude. His beard, more salt than pepper these days, caught the golden light as he worked. Nearby, his ancient blue-tick hound, Moses, dozed on the porch, occasionally twitching in his sleep. The dog was nearly as old as Elijah's time on the mountain, a faithful companion who asked little and gave much. Another day in paradise, Moses, Elijah muttered, his voice rough from disuse. Speaking aloud had become a habit only to remind himself he still could. Moses lifted his head briefly, acknowledging his master with rheumy eyes, before settling back into slumber. The cabin itself was a testament to Elijah's self-sufficiency, hand-hewn logs, chinked with a mixture of mud and moss, a stone chimney he'd built himself, and a small vegetable garden out back that provided most of his summer sustenance. Solar panels, his one concession to modern technology, powered the few electrical appliances he owned. A radio, a small refrigerator, and a laptop he used primarily for weather forecasts and occasional emails to his estranged daughter in Seattle. Elijah had just finished cleaning his knife when the first tremor hit. Subtle at first, a gentle vibration that rattled the tin cups hanging by his sink. Moses lifted his head, ears perked, a low whine building in his throat. "Easy, boy," Elijah said, though unease crept up his spine. Earthquakes weren't uncommon in these parts, but something about this one felt different. The second tremor came stronger, violent enough to send his morning coffee sloshing over the rim of his mug. The cabin groaned in protest, decades-old timber creaking under the strain. Outside, birds erupted from the trees in panicked clouds. "Damn it all," Elijah growled, grabbing his rifle from its place above the door, more instinct than rational thought. What good a Winchester would do against an earthquake was anyone's guess, but the weight of it in his hands was reassuring. The third tremor brought him to his knees. The earth beneath the cabin seemed to heave like a living thing, and a sound like thunder rolled up from the depths. Moses howled, a mournful sound that raised the hair on Elijah's arms. Through the window, he watched in horror as a fissure opened in the ground just beyond his garden, a jagged line that split the earth like a wound. When the shaking finally subsided, an eerie silence fell over the mountain. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just the heavy sound of his own breathing and Moses's continued whimpering. "Come on, boy," Elijah said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Let's see what we're dealing with." Outside, the air smelled wrong, metallic and ancient, like the inside of a long-sealed tomb. The fissure was wider than it had appeared from inside, perhaps 3 feet across at its widest point. Elijah approached cautiously, Moses trailing reluctantly behind him. The dog stopped several feet away, refusing to come closer despite Elijah's coaxing. "What's got into you?" Elijah muttered, though he couldn't blame the animal. Something about the crack in the earth set his teeth on edge. Kneeling at the edge, Elijah peered into the darkness below. The fissure seemed to descend forever, a throat of stone swallowing the light. He picked up a small rock and dropped it in, counting seconds. 1, 2, 3, for the faint clatter when it finally hit bottom suggested a depth of at least 100 feet. "Well, that's not ideal," he said, to no one in particular, a habit of understatement that had served him well through life's various catastrophes. As he stood, a gust of air escaped from the fissure knot, the cool draft he might have expected from a subterranean opening, but warm and fetid, carrying the unmistakable scent of decay. Moses backed away further, hackles raised, a growl rumbling in his chest. "I hear you," Elijah said, stepping back himself. "Nothing good comes from holes in the ground." That night, sleep eluded him. The cabin, usually a haven of peace, felt exposed and vulnerable. Every creak of settling timber, every whisper of wind through the chinks had him reaching for his rifle. Moses refused to settle, pacing from window to door and back again, occasionally freezing to stare into the darkness outside with a focus that chilled Elijah's blood. Around midnight, the first sounds came faint at first, almost imperceptible. A scratching, like claws on stone. Then a chittering noise that reminded Elijah of insects, but magnified, distorted. Moses growled continuously now, his eyes fixed on the cabin door. Nothing out there but critters spooked by the quake, Elijah told himself, not believing it for a second. By dawn, exhaustion had finally pulled him into a fitful doze. He woke with a start to Moses's frantic barking. Outside, the morning light revealed nothing, a missed first glance. But as Elijah stepped onto his porch, coffee in hand, he noticed the tracks. They surrounded the cabin, hundreds of them, overlapping and chaotic. Some resembled lizard prints, three-toed with sharp claw marks, but impossibly large. Others were more insect-like, delicate punctures in the soft earth as if from jointed legs. Most disturbing were the sinuous trails that wound between them, like those left by massive snakes or something worse. All led back to the fissure, which in the daylight looked even more ominous. A gaping wound in the earth from which wisps of greenish vapor now rose. "This ain't right," Elijah muttered, setting down his coffee with shaking hands. "This ain't right at all." As if in response, a sound emerged from the fissure low. Resonant call that was neither animal nor human. A sound that seemed to bypass his ears entirely and vibrate directly in his chest cavity. Moses howled in response, a sound of pure animal terror. In the trees beyond the clearing, something moved, something large enough to shake branches 30 feet up. Elijah raised his rifle instinctively, though the rational part of his brain screamed that whatever was out there was beyond the capabilities of his trusty Winchester. A flash of iridescent scales caught the morning light, there and gone so quickly he might have imagined it. But the cracking of underbrush and the continued agitation of the forest canopy confirmed he wasn't hallucinating. Inside, Elijah commanded, backing slowly toward the cabin door. "Inside, now." For once, the old hound didn't argue, bolting past him into the relative safety of the cabin. Elijah followed, securing the door with trembling hands. He moved methodically through the small space, checking the integrity of shutters and the single back door, his mind racing. In 3 decades on this mountain, he'd encountered bears, mountain lions, even a wolverine once, but nothing that explained what he'd just witnessed. Nothing that explained the otherworldly call from the depths of the earth, or the massive, sinuous movement among the trees. As he secured the last window, his gaze fell on the old CB radio in the corner, his emergency link to the ranger station in the valley below. He hadn't used it in years, preferring his isolation to the awkward conversations with rangers half his age. But now, his hand hovered over the transmitter. What would he even say? That an earthquake had opened a hole in the ground and now prehistoric monsters were stalking his property. They'd think he'd finally lost his mind, the crazy old hermit up on Black Peak. A thunderous impact against the side of the cabin made the decision for him. The entire structure shuddered, dust raining from the rafters. Moses yelped, diving under the bed. Outside, something massive scraped against the logs, a sound like giant claws testing the strength of his sanctuary. Elijah grabbed the radio, fingers fumbling with the dial. Static filled the room, oddly comforting in its normalcy. "This is Elijah Thorne, up on Black Peak," he said, his voice steadier than he expected. "We've had some kind of situation after this morning's quake. I need the transmission cut off abruptly as another impact rocked the cabin, this one strong enough to knock the radio from his hands. It clattered to the floor, the speaker emitting nothing but dead air. Outside, the chittering sound had grown louder, joined now by what could only be described as hissing laughter. Elijah retrieved his rifle and the box of ammunition from the shelf, loading with practiced efficiency despite his fear. "Looks like it's just you and me, Moses," he said, checking the site. "Whatever's out there, they picked the wrong mountain man to mess with." As if in direct challenge to his bravado, a shadow fell across the window, something massive, blocking out the morning sun. Elijah raised his rifle, knowing with grim certainty that his peaceful existence on Mount Black Peak had come to an end. The solitude he had cherished for so long had been shattered, and in its place was a nightmare crawling from the depths of the earth itself. Elijah's heart hammered against his ribs as the shadow outside his window shifted, revealing glimpses of what appeared to be an armored hide covered in iridescent scales. The creature moved with a fluidity that belied its size, circling the cabin with predatory patience. Moses had retreated to the farthest corner under the bed, his whimpers the only sound besides Elijah's ragged breathing. "Steady now," Elijah whispered to himself, rifle trained on the door. His hands, usually rock steady from years of hunting, trembled slightly. Whatever was out there wasn't natural, wasn't something that belonged in his world. A sudden silence fell, more terrifying than the sounds that had preceded it. Elijah held his breath, straining to hear any movement. Then, as abruptly as it had appeared, the presence withdrew. Through a crack in the shutters, he watched an enormous shape, difficult to discern clearly, retreat toward the fissure, its movement a disturbing combination of reptilian slither and insectoid skitter. Only when it disappeared into the crack in the earth did Elijah allow himself to exhale. "What in God's name was that?" he muttered, lowering his rifle slightly. The respite was short-lived. As morning stretched into afternoon, more sounds emerged from the fissure, chittering, hissing, and occasionally a deep, resonant call that seemed to vibrate the very air. Moses refused to leave the cabin, and Elijah couldn't blame him, but they needed water, and the well was 30 yards from the back door. "Can't just sit here waiting to die of thirst," Elijah told the dog, who responded with a look that clearly suggested this was exactly what they should do. Gathering his courage and his Winchester, Elijah cracked open the back door. The clearing appeared empty, though the forest beyond seemed unnaturally still. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just an oppressive silence that pressed against his eardrums. He made it halfway to the well when he spotted it a patch of earth near the fissure that hadn't been there that morning. Something was growing there, spreading outward from the crack like a stain. As he approached cautiously, he realized it was some kind of fungus. Fungus could be electric blue and pulsate with an internal light. "What fresh hell is this?" Elijah murmured, kneeling to examine the growth without touching it. The fungus seemed to respond to his proximity, the pulsations increasing in frequency. Tiny filaments reached upward, swaying like underwater plants, despite the absence of any breeze. A memory surfaced from decades ago, a biology textbook open on his college desk, before the world went to hell and he retreated to this mountain. Mycelium networks, the largest living organisms on Earth, spreading unseen beneath the forest floor. But this was no ordinary fungus. This was something alien. The sound of breaking branches snapped his attention back to the present. Something was moving through the forest, heading his way. Abandoning his quest for water, Elijah sprinted back to the cabin, slamming the door behind him just as a new creature emerged from the tree line. This one was smaller than what he'd glimpsed earlier, perhaps the size of a large dog butt, no less terrifying. It resembled a cross between a lizard and a mantis, with a segmented body supported by 6 jointed legs and a head that swiveled independently, dominated by compound eyes that gleamed with unsettling intelligence. Its mouth opened to reveal rows of needle-like teeth as it tested the air, clearly sensing his recent presence. Most disturbing was the patch of blue fungus growing from its back, the same pulsating organism he'd seen by the fissure. The creature moved with purpose toward the cabin, its head swiveling to track his movement through the walls. "It can sense me," Elijah realized with growing horror. "The damn thing knows exactly where I am." He watched through the shutters as the creature circled the cabin, occasionally rising on its hind legs to scratch at the walls. Its claws left deep gouges in the wood, confirming Elijah's suspicion that his sanctuary wouldn't hold against a determined assault. As darkness fell, more creatures emerged from the fissure. Elijah counted at least a dozen different species, each more nightmarish than the last. Some resembled prehistoric creatures he recognized from documentaries, proto-mammals with elongated fangs, arthropods the size of house cats, reptiles with frills and horns that had no business existing in the modern world. Others defied classification entirely, bearing anatomical features that seemed to belong to no earthly kingdom. All shared one common trait: patches of the luminescent blue fungus growing from their bodies, pulsating in an unsettling synchronicity. "They're connected," Elijah whispered to Moses, who had finally emerged from under the bed to peer cautiously through the window beside him. "The fungusids connecting them somehow." By midnight, the clearing around his cabin had become an alien landscape. The blue fungus had spread in all directions, covering nearly an acre of ground. It emitted enough light to cast eerie shadows, transforming the familiar terrain into something from another world. The creatures moved through this glowing carpet with evident comfort, some even appearing to feed on it. Elijah's scientific curiosity, dormant for decades, stirred reluctantly to life. Despite his fear, he found himself cataloging details, forming hypotheses. The earthquake must have opened a passage to some kind of subterranean ecosystem, sealed away for millennia. These creatures weren't invaders from another planet, they were Earth's forgotten children, evolving in isolation deep beneath the surface. Lazarus taxa, he murmured, the term surfacing from his long-abandoned studies. Species thought extinct, rediscovered alive. Except these weren't just individual species, this was an entire ecosystem, preserved like a time capsule and now released into a world utterly unprepared for their return. The fungus was the key. It seemed to be spreading rapidly, transforming the environment to suit its ancient inhabitants. If it continued unchecked, how far would it spread? The thought of it reaching the valley below, the small town where he occasionally traded for supplies, sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the night air. Dawn brought no relief. The fungus had continued its inexorable spread overnight, now covering his vegetable garden and creeping up the walls of the cabin itself. Where it touched, the woods seemed to soften and change, taking on a bluish tint. "We can't stay here," Elijah told Moses, who watched him with solemn eyes as he packed a rucksack with essentials: water, jerky, ammunition, his ancient first aid kit. "This place won't be safe much longer." As if to emphasize his point, a section of roof creaked ominously where the fungus had begun to digest the wooden shingles. How long before the entire structure was compromised? Hours, days. He couldn't risk finding out. The question was where to go. Down the mountain seemed logical. Seek help, warn others. But that would mean leading these creatures directly to civilization. Up, then higher into the peaks where the air grew thin and cold. Perhaps the fungus couldn't survive at higher elevations. A sudden commotion outside interrupted his planning. Through the window, he saw several of the smaller creatures gathered around something at the edge of the clearing. As they dispersed, he caught a glimpse of their focussar deer, or what had once been a deer. Now it lay twitching on the ground, patches of blue fungus already sprouting from its hide as it underwent some grotesque transformation. "They're not just spreading," Elijah realized with growing horror. "They're converting." The implications hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't just an invasion, it was a terraforming operation. The fungus wasn't merely changing the environment, it was changing the inhabitants as well. How long before larger animals were affected? How long before humans became targets? His decision made, Elijah shouldered his pack and checked his rifle one last time. Moses watched him anxiously, sensing the imminent departure. "We're heading up, old friend," Elijah told him, scratching behind the hound's ears. "But first, we need to understand what we're dealing with. That means getting a closer look at where these nightmares are coming from." The fissure had widened overnight, now nearly 6 feet across at its widest point. The blue fungus formed a thick carpet around its edges, pulsating more intensely here than anywhere else. Heat radiated from the opening, along with that same ancient, musty smell that had first alerted Elijah that something was wrong. Keeping low and moving carefully from tree to tree, Elijah approached the edge of the clearing. Moses followed reluctantly, staying close to his heels. The creatures seemed most active near the fissure itself. with fewer venturing to the perimeter where the fungus was still establishing itself. From his vantage point behind a large pine, Elijah could see down into the crack. The blue glow intensified in the depths, illuminating a vast cavern that shouldn't have existed beneath his mountain. Stalactites hung like teeth from the ceiling, but they were wrong, somehow organic looking, covered in the same fungal growth that was spreading across his property. Movement caught his eye. Something massive was emerging from the depths. Elijah held his breath as an enormous shape pulled itself up through the fissure with ponderous strength. It resembled a crocodile, but stretched and distorted to nightmarish proportions, at least 20 feet from snout to tail. Its back was a forest of bony plates, each hosting a thriving colony of the blue fungus. As it hauled itself onto the surface, Elijah noticed with horror that it wasn't alone. Clinging to its hide were dozens of smaller creatures, parasites or offspring. He couldn't tell. They detached as the behemoth fully emerged, scattering into the surrounding forest like scouts. "Dear God," Elijah whispered, his voice barely audible even to himself. "There's a whole world down there." Moses growled softly beside him, hackles raised. Too late, Elijah realized his mistake. The dog's warning came just as one of the smaller creatures, the mantis lizard hybrid he'd seen earlier, turned its compound eyes directly toward their hiding place. It made no sound as it began moving toward them, but its intent was unmistakable. Behind it, the massive crocodilian thing swiveled its head in their direction, nostrils flaring as it caught their scent. "Run," Elijah hissed to Moses, abandoning stealth for speed. "Run, now." Elijah's legs pumped furiously as he sprinted through the underbrush, Moses a blur of motion beside him. Behind them, the chittering of the mantis lizard creature grew louder, joined by the thunderous footfalls of the crocodilian behemoth. The forest, once a sanctuary of familiar paths and hiding spots, now seemed like a labyrinth designed to slow his escape. "This way," Elijah gasped, veering sharply to the right where the terrain grew rockier. His old knees protested the sudden change in direction, but decades of mountain living had kept him fitter than most men half his age. The smaller creature might navigate the boulder field with ease, but the larger one would struggle more, so he hoped. Moses leaped nimbly from rock to rock, his survival instincts overriding his arthritic joints. Elijah followed, less gracefully, but with the determined efficiency of a man who knew his life depended on it. A glance over his shoulder confirmed his strategy was working. The massive crocodilian beast had slowed, its bulk unsuited to the jagged terrain. The mantis lizard, however, showed no such limitation. It skittered across the rocks with disturbing speed, compound eyes fixed on its prey. Elijah could hear its mandibles clicking in what sounded disturbingly like anticipation. "Keep going, boy," Elijah urged Moses as they reached the far side of the boulder field. Just ahead lay an old mining tunnel, a relic from the mountain's brief gold rush days, a century earlier. Elijah had explored it thoroughly when he first settled here, finding nothing but abandoned equipment and a colony of bats. Now it represented their best hope for shelter. They reached the tunnel entrance with the creature just 30 yards behind. Elijah fumbled in his pack for the emergency flashlight he always carried, clicking it on as they plunged into the darkness. The beam caught dust motes swirling in the stale air and glinted off the rusted remains of mining carts. Far enough, Elijah wheezed, Stopping about 50 feet, and he unslung his rifle and turned to face the entrance, Moses panting heavily beside him. "Let's see if our friend follows us in here." The answer came moments later as the mantis lizard appeared at the tunnel mouth, its silhouette backlit by daylight. It paused, head swiveling as it assessed this new environment. Then, with a sound like knives scraping stone, it began to advance. Elijah raised his Winchester, steadying his breathing as he sighted down the barrel. The creature moved in a stop-start pattern that made targeting difficult, but he'd been hunting since he was 8 years old. Patience was second nature. "That's it," he murmured as the thing paused again, seemingly confused by the echo of its own movements. Just a little closer. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was deafening in the confined space, the muzzle flash momentarily blinding. When his vision cleared, he saw the creature thrashing on the tunnel floor, greenish ichor spraying from a wound in what passed for its shoulder. But it wasn't dead. Far from it. With a screech that set Elijah's teeth on edge, it righted itself and charged. Damn it all. Elijah fumbled to chamber another round, but the creature was too fast. It launched itself at him, mandibles spread wide. He barely had time to swing the rifle up as a shield before impact sent him sprawling backward. The Winchester clattered away into the darkness as Elijah found himself pinned beneath the writhing creature. Its weight was surprising, perhaps 200 pounds of chitinous armor and corded muscle. Up close, the smell of it was overwhelming, that same ancient musty odor that emanated from the fissure, but mixed with something chemical and acrid. Its mandibles snapped inches from his face as he strained to hold it back. His forearms braced against its thorax. The blue fungus growing from its back pulsed rapidly, seeming to brighten with excitement. "Get off me," Elijah grunted, muscles trembling with the effort of keeping those needle teeth from his throat. A blur of motion to his right, Moses, launching himself at the creature with a ferocity Elijah hadn't seen in years. The old hound clamped his jaws around one of the creature's jointed legs, growling and shaking his head violently. The mantis lizard screeched again, momentarily distracted. It was all the opening Elijah needed. With his right hand still bracing against the creature, his left groped desperately at his belt for his hunting knife. His fingers closed around the handle just as the creature shook Moses off and refocused its attention. "Eat this," Elijah snarled, driving the blade upward with all his strength into the soft tissue where the creature's head joined its thorax. The result was explosive, literally. The knife punctured what must have been some kind of pressurized sac. A geyser of the greenish ichor erupted, coating Elijah's face and chest in burning slime. He yelled in pain and disgust, shoving the now convulsing creature off him. "Sweet Jesus," he spluttered, wiping frantically at his eyes. The substance stung like acid, but didn't seem to be causing lasting damage. The same couldn't be said for his favorite flannel shirt, which was dissolving where the ichor had splashed most heavily. The creature gave one final shudder and went still, its compound eyes dimming like lights being switched off. The blue fungus on its back, however, continued to pulse, though the rhythm was slowing. "You okay, Moses?" Elijah asked, turning to check on his companion. The dog was limping slightly, but appeared otherwise unharmed, his muzzle stained with the greenish fluid. He approached the dead creature cautiously, sniffing at it before backing away with a sneeze of disgust. "Yeah, I don't blame you," Elijah muttered. retrieving his knife and wiping it clean on a relatively untouched portion of his jeans. Nasty piece of work. He recovered his rifle and flashlight, then turned his attention back to the creature. Scientific curiosity once again overrode his revulsion. This was the first specimen he'd been able to examine up close, and despite the circumstances, he wasn't going to waste the opportunity. "Let's see what makes you tick," he said, kneeling beside the carcass. Using his knife, he carefully probed the anatomy, making mental notes. The exoskeleton was unlike anything he'd seen. Not quite insect, not quite reptile, but some impossible hybrid. The internal organs were equally baffling, arranged in a way that defied conventional biology. Most interesting was the relationship between the creature and the fungus. The growth wasn't merely superficial. Filaments extended deep into the body, intertwining with what appeared to be the nervous system. It wasn't a parasite, it was a symbiont. You're not just carrying it, Elijah realized. You're part of it, or it's part of you. A distant roar from outside the tunnel reminded him that the crocodilian monster was still out there, possibly searching for its smaller companion. Time to move. "Come on, Moses," he said, gathering his gear. "We've overstayed our welcome." The tunnel had a second exeter, vertical shaft with rusted ladder rungs leading to a higher elevation on the mountainside. Elijah had never had reason to use it before, but he'd made note of it during his explorations. Now, it offered a perfect escape route. The climb was arduous, especially for Moses. Elijah had to fashion a makeshift harness from his belt and shirt remnants, securing the dog to his back like a furry, squirming backpack. By the time they emerged onto a rocky ledge 300 feet up the mountainside, both were exhausted. "We made it, boy," Elijah panted, setting Moses down gently. "We actually made it." From their elevated position, they had a clear view of the valley below, including Elijah's cabin and the surrounding clearing. What he saw made his blood run cold. The blue fungus had spread even further in the short time since their flight, now covering nearly half a mile in every direction from the fissure. The cabin was completely engulfed, its wooden structure distorted and partially collapsed as the fungus digested it. More creatures had emerged, dozens of them, ranging from dog-sized to the massive crocodilian behemoth he'd seen earlier. They moved through the transformed landscape with purpose. Some carrying objects he couldn't identify, others appearing to be constructing something around the edges of the fissure. "They're building," Elijah whispered in horrified fascination. "They're not just emerging, they're establishing a colony." As he watched, a new type of creature emerged from the fissure tool, spindly things that walked on two legs, their movements eerily humanoid despite their alien appearance. They directed the activities of the others, gesturing with elongated limbs that ended in what looked disturbingly like hands. "Intelligence," Elijah murmured. "Actual intelligence." The implications were staggering. This wasn't just an ecosystem that had been sealed away. It was a civilization, one that had evolved in isolation for God knew how long, and now they were reclaiming territory that had once been theirs. A sudden comical gurgle from his stomach reminded Elijah that he hadn't eaten since dawn. The adrenaline of survival had suppressed his hunger, but now it returned with a vengeance. He rummaged in his pack for the jerky he'd packed, offering a piece to Moses before chewing on his own. "What a fine mess we're in," he told the dog, who seemed more interested in food than philosophical observations about their predicament. Prehistoric monsters building a colony on my property. Wouldn't believe it if I wasn't seeing it with my own eyes. As he ate, Elijah took stock of their situation. They were alive, which was the good news. They had escaped immediate danger and had supplies to last a few days if they were careful. The bad news was, well, everything else. His home was gone. The creatures were spreading rapidly, and he had no idea how to stop them more, even if he should try. These weren't invaders from another world. They were Earth's original inhabitants, returning after an unimaginably long exile. Did he have the right to interfere? On the other hand, if the fungus continued to spread at its current rate, it would reach the nearest town within weeks. What then? Would the military be called in? Would they nuke the entire mountain? The thought of his peaceful refuge becoming ground zero for what could only be described as an apocalyptic event made his chest tighten. "We need help," he admitted reluctantly to Moses, but not the shoot-first-ask-questions-later kind. There was a settlement about 10 miles down the mountain, not the town where he occasionally traded for supplies, but a small community of indigenous people who had lived in these mountains for countless generations. Elijah had limited contact with them over the years, but he'd always respected their knowledge of the land and its history. If anyone might have insight into what was happening, it would be them. Ancient creatures emerging from the depths of the earth. That was the kind of thing that might appear in tribal legends. Decision made, Elijah repacked his meager supplies and checked his compass. The settlement lay to the southeast, a hard day's journey through difficult terrain. They'd need to move quickly if they wanted to reach it before nightfall. "Ready for another adventure, old friend?" he asked Moses, who responded with a weary thump of his tail against the rocky ground. "Yeah, me neither. But sitting here won't solve anything." As they set off along the ridge, Elijah cast one last glance back at what had been his home for nearly 3 decades. The blue glow of the fungus was visible even in daylight now, a spreading stain on the landscape that represented the end of one life and the uncertain beginning of another. 30 years of peace and quiet, he muttered, adjusting his pack. Should have known it was too good to last. The journey to the indigenous settlement was more arduous than Elijah had anticipated. What should have been a day's hike stretched into evening as he and Moses navigated treacherous terrain, deliberately avoiding the lower paths where they might encounter more creatures from the fissure. The old hound's limp had worsened, forcing frequent stops to rest his arthritic joints. Just a little further, Elijah encouraged, though he wasn't entirely sure this was true. The settlement wasn't marked on any official maps. The tribe preferred it that Wayond, his own mental cartography of the area, was based on rare, distant glimpses during hunting expeditions. As twilight deepened into dusk, the temperature dropped sharply. Elijah's breath formed clouds in the chill air as he helped Moses over a particularly steep section of trail. The dog whined softly, his loyalty overriding his discomfort. "I know, boy," Elijah murmured. "We'll rest soon, I promise." Just as he was considering making camp for the night, Elijah caught the faint scent of wood smoke on the breeze. He paused, nostrils flaring. Yes, definitely wood smoke, and not far off. Relief flooded through him, giving his tired legs a second wind. "Smell that?" he asked Moses, who had indeed perked up, nose twitching, were close. 20 minutes later, they crested a small rise and looked down into a sheltered valley. There, nestled against the mountainside, lay the settlement, a collection of structures that blended so perfectly with the landscape that they seemed to have grown from the earth itself. Some were traditional hide-covered lodges, others more modern cabins built from local timber, but all existed in harmony with their surroundings. Lights glowed warmly from within the dwellings, and figures moved about a central fire pit. The scene was so peaceful, so normal, that for a moment Elijah almost convinced himself the horrors he'd witnessed were just a vivid nightmare. As they approached, a dog barked, then another and another. Soon, a chorus of canine alerts had drawn human attention. Several figures moved to the perimeter of the settlement, flashlight beams cutting through the gathering darkness to illuminate the newcomers. "That's far enough," called a male voice, firm but not hostile. "Identify yourself." "Name's Elijah Thorne," he called back, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I lived on the north face of Black Peak. I need to speak with your elders. It's urgent." There was a brief consultation among the figures, voices too low for Elijah to make out. Then the same man spoke again, the hermit from Black Peak. "We know of you. Come forward slowly." Elijah did as instructed, Moses limping faithfully at his side. As they entered the circle of light, he got his first clear look at the welcoming committee, 3 men and a woman, all dressed in practical outdoor clothing rather than the stereotypical indigenous garb tourists might expect. They carried no weapons that he could see, but their stance suggested they could defend themselves if necessary. The oldest of the group, a man perhaps in his 60s with a deeply lined face and salt and pepper hair pulled back in a ponytail, stepped forward. "I am Joseph Running Bear," he said, extending a hand. "Chief of what remains of the Enmank people in these mountains. What brings you to us after all these years of solitude, Elijah Thorne?" Elijah shook the offered hand, noting the strength in the older man's grip. "Something's happened on Black Peak," he said, suddenly aware of how fantastical his story would sound. "An earthquake opened something that should have stayed buried. Creatures, things that shouldn't exist there, coming out of the mountain, spreading." He expected skepticism, perhaps even laughter. Instead, Joseph's expression grew grave. He exchanged glances with the woman beside him, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "The old ones have returned," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Elijah stared at her, momentarily speechless. "You know about them?" Joseph sighed heavily. "Come, you look exhausted, and your dog needs attention. We will talk inside." They were led to a large communal building at the center of the settlement. Inside, the space was warm and inviting, illuminated by a combination of electric lights powered by solar panels and the traditional glow of a central hearth. Several elders were already gathered, as if they'd been expecting visitors. A young woman took charge of Moses, leading him to a corner where she began examining his injured leg with gentle, practiced hands. The dog submitted to her ministrations with surprising trust, sensing perhaps that help had finally arrived. Elijah was guided to a seat near the fire and handed a steaming mug of something that smelled of herbs and honey. He took a grateful sip, feeling warmth spread through his chilled body. "Now," said Joseph, taking a seat across from him. "Tell us everything. Leave nothing out, no matter how strange it may seem." So Elijah did. He described the earthquake, the fissure, the creatures that emerged. He told them about the blue fungus and its rapid spread, about the intelligence he'd witnessed and the construction taking place around the opening. As he spoke, the elders listened in silence, their faces revealing neither disbelief nor, surprisingly, a deepening concern. When he finished, Joseph turned to an elderly woman seated to his right. "Grandmother, it seems the stories were true after all." The woman, whose face was a map of wrinkles surrounding eyes that remained sharp and alert, nodded slowly. "The sealed door has been opened," she said, her English accented but clear. "Just as our ancestors foretold." "What stories?" Elijah asked, looking between them. "What do you know about these things?" The old woman, grandmother, as Joseph had called her, leaned forward, firelight dancing across her features. "Our people have lived in these mountains since time beyond memory," she began. "Our oldest stories tell of a time when the world was young and different beings walked the earth. Not just animals as we know them, but creatures of many forms, some wise, some terrible." She gestured with gnarled hands as she spoke, as if shaping the tale from the air itself. There came a great conflict between these beings and the early humans, a war that nearly destroyed both sides. In the end, neither could claim victory, but a pact was made. The old ones would retreat into the deep places of the earth, sealing themselves away from the surface world. Humans would remain above, guardians of the sealed doors. For countless generations, our people maintained the sacred sites where these doors were located, performing rituals to strengthen the seals. But as our numbers dwindled and the old ways were forgotten or abandoned, many of these sites were lost to memory. Joseph picked up the thread. "We knew there was such a door somewhere on Black Peak, but its exact location was lost generations ago. The earthquake must have damaged the natural seal that had held for thousands of years." Elijah took another sip of his drink, trying to process what he was hearing. So these creatures, these old ones, they were here before us, and now they want to reclaim the surface. "It is more complicated than simple territory," grandmother said. "The world they knew is gone. The air, the light, even the position of the stars all changed. They seek to remake their environment, to transform our world back into one they can inhabit." The blue fungus, Elijah realized. "It's terraforming." Joseph nodded. "Our stories speak of the blue veil that would spread across the land if the old ones ever returned. It changes everything it touches, preparing the way for them." "How do we stop it?" Elijah asked, setting down his mug. "There must be a way to seal them back in." A heavy silence fell over the gathering. Finally, grandmother spoke again, her eyes fixed on Elijah with unsettling intensity. "The stories say that when the door opens, the mountain will choose a champion one who knows its paths and secrets, one who respects the old ways, even if they are not of our blood. This champion must journey to the heart of the opening and perform the sealing ritual." Elijah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "And you think that's me? I'm just a hermit who wanted to be left alone. The mountain chooses who it will," grandmother said simply. "You lived in harmony with it for many years. You came to us for help rather than bringing soldiers with their guns and bombs. Perhaps you are the one, perhaps not, but time grows short. Joseph leaned forward, his expression grave. The ritual requires specific items of crystal from the highest peak, water from the sacred spring, and blood freely given by one who remembers the old ways. But most importantly, it requires knowledge, the ancient words that bind the old ones to their pact. And you have these words? Elijah asked. Grandmother nodded slowly. I am the last who remembers them in their entirety. I will teach them to you. Elijah ran a hand through his beard, overwhelmed. Even if I learn these words, even if I gather these items, how am I supposed to get close enough to perform this ritual? You haven't seen these creatures. They're not going to stand aside and let me seal them away again. The ritual must be performed at the nexus point where the energies of their world meet ours, Joseph explained. Based on what you've described, that would be the fissure itself. Great, Elijah muttered. Right in the heart of their emerging colony. You will not go alone, grandmother said. The spirits of our ancestors will guide you. And she paused, looking toward the entrance of the building. It seems others have been drawn to this conflict as well. Elijah followed her gaze. The door had opened, admitting to newcomers a woman and a man, both looking travel-worn and slightly bewildered at finding themselves in the middle of what appeared to be a tribal council. The woman was in her 30s, with wild curly hair barely contained by a bandana, and glasses that magnified already intense eyes. She wore cargo pants, covered in pockets, and a jacket festooned with patches from various scientific expeditions. The man beside her was taller, more conventionally handsome, dressed in the unmistakable uniform of a park ranger. Sorry to interrupt, the woman said, her voice carrying a hint of an Australian accent. I'm Dr. Samantha Wells, Cryptoz. This is Ranger Mike Delgado. We've been getting reports of unusual wildlife activity on Black Peak. Thought we'd check in with the local community before heading up there. She glanced around the room, her gaze settling on Elijah. Though from the looks of things, we might be a bit late to the party. Joseph rose to his feet. You have come at a crucial time, Dr. Wells. Please, join us. We have much to discuss, and the night grows short. As the newcomers were ushered to seats near the fire, Elijah caught grandmother watching him with those penetrating eyes. She nodded once, as if confirming something to herself. The mountain has spoken, she murmured, just loud enough for him to hear. The pieces begin to gather. Elijah looked from the old woman to the unlikely new arrivals, then down at Moses, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep under the care of the young healer. His peaceful mountain existence seemed a lifetime away now, replaced by ancient prophecies and looming responsibilities he'd never asked for. The mountain's chosen one, he muttered under his breath, recalling grandmother's words. Should have moved to Florida when I had the chance. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faintest trace of that alien, musty scent, reminder that while they talked, the old ones continued their inexorable emergence. Time, as grandmother had said, was growing short indeed. The communal building buzzed with tension as Dr. Samantha Wells and Ranger Mike Delgado settled in. Elijah studied them warily from across the fire pit. The cryptozoologist was already pulling a tablet from one of her many pockets, her fingers dancing across the screen with practiced efficiency. The ranger maintained a more reserved posture, his eyes constantly scanning the room as if assessing potential threats. "So, Dr. Wells began without preamble. You've seen them too, haven't you? The creatures?" Her gaze locked onto Elijah with laser-like intensity. "That's why you're here." Elijah exchanged glances with Joseph, who gave a slight nod. "I've seen them," he confirmed gruffly. "My cabin was right next to where they're coming out. Barely got away with my life. I knew it," Dr. Wells exclaimed, nearly bouncing in her seat with excitement. "The reports we've been getting were too consistent to be mass hallucination or misidentification. Multiple sightings of unclassified fauna, strange bioluminescence, seismic activity, classic cryptid emergence pattern." Ranger Delgado cleared his throat. "Sam, maybe dial back the enthusiasm a notch. People are scared." He turned to address the group. "We've had hikers reporting strange animal encounters for the past week. Then yesterday's earthquake triggered a flood of calls about blue lights on Black Peak. The Forest Service sent me to investigate. And Dr. Wells, well, she invited herself along." "Invited myself?" Sam scoffed. "Mike, your supervisor practically begged me to consult after those photos came in." "What photos?" Elijah asked sharply. Sam tapped her tablet and turned it around. On the screen was a blurry image that made Elijah's blood run cold. One of the mantis lizard creatures, partially obscured by foliage, but unmistakable. "Hiker took this 3 days ago. Thought it was some kind of mutant mountain lion at first." 3 days, Elijah frowned. "But the earthquake was yesterday." "The main quake, yes," Sam nodded. "But there have been minor tremors for weeks. The fissure must have been opening gradually before yesterday's event blew it wide open." Grandmother leaned forward, her weathered hands clasped tightly in her lap. The seals were weakening. "We should have known, should have felt it." "With all due respect, ma'am," Ranger Delgado said gently, "no one could have predicted this. Whatever these creatures are, they are the old ones," Grandmother interrupted firmly. "Ancient beings who ruled this land long before humans. They were sealed beneath the mountains when our worlds could no longer coexist." Sam's eyes widened behind her glasses. "A prehistoric ecosystem preserved in a subterranean environment. That's incredible. Do you have any documentation of these legends? Any artifacts?" Joseph raised a hand to temper her enthusiasm. "Dr. Wells, this is not an academic exercise. The return of the old ones threatens everything. The blue fungus, you mentioned it, transforms our world to suit them. If it spreads beyond the mountain, it's already covering at least half a mile around the fissure," Elijah interjected. "And growing fast." Mike's professional demeanor cracked slightly. "Half a mile in one day. That's impossible." "I saw it with my own eyes," Elijah insisted. "And it's not just spreading, it's changing everything it touches. The wood of my cabin, the soil." Even he hesitated, remembering the deer, even animals. Sam was typing furiously on her tablet. "Aggressive, xenoforming, fascinating and terrifying. We need samples, measurements, documentation. What we need," Elijah cut in, "is to seal that fissure before it's too late. According to Grandmother, there's a ritual that might work, but it has to be performed at the opening itself." Mike laughed incredulously. "A ritual? You want to fight an invasive species with what? Magic?" Grandmother fixed him with a stare that made the ranger shift uncomfortably. What you call science and what we call magic are not so different, young man. Both seek to understand and influence the forces that shape our world. I've seen enough to know we're dealing with something beyond conventional explanation, Elijah said. If grandmother says this ritual might work, I'm willing to try it. Sam looked between them, her scientific skepticism warring with the evidence of her own eyes. Even if we accept this premise, and I'm not saying I do, how exactly do you plan to get close enough to perform any kind of ritual? From what you've described, the fissure is at the center of an alien colony now. That's where you two come in, Joseph said. Elijah knows the mountain, but he cannot do this alone. The ranger has training in wilderness survival and emergency response. And you, Dr. Wells, have studied unusual creatures your entire career. Together, you might succeed where one would fail. Mike stood up abruptly. Whoa, hold on. I came here to assess a wildlife situation and possibly coordinate evacuations if needed. I did not sign up for some mystical mission impossible. And what will you evacuate to, Ranger Delgado? Grandmother asked quietly. If the blue veil continues to spread, where will your evacuees go? How far will they need to run? An uncomfortable silence fell over the gathering. Elijah could see the calculations running behind Mike's eyes, the logistics of a mass evacuation, the limited resources, the inevitable panic. I need to report this, Mike said finally. Get proper authorities involved. The military, and what will they do? Elijah demanded, rising to his feet. Bomb the mountain. Unleash some experimental weapon. You think that will stop what's happening? We don't know what will stop it, Mike shot back. But I know rushing in half-cocked with some ancient ritual isn't standard protocol. There is no protocol for this, Sam said quietly, surprising everyone. She'd been studying her tablet, scrolling through what appeared to be satellite imagery. Look, she turned the screen so everyone could see. These are thermal images from a NOAA satellite. The blue area that's significantly cooler than the surrounding forest, and it's growing. I've run a projection algorithm. She swiped to a new image, a simulation showing the spread over time. At the current rate, it will reach the nearest town in 9 days, the county seat in 14, Portland in under a month. Mike stared at the projection, the color draining from his face. That can't be right. I hope it isn't, Sam replied grimly. But even if my calculations are off by 50%, we're still talking about an ecological disaster unlike anything in recorded history. Elijah looked at the cryptozoologist with newfound respect. Beneath her enthusiastic exterior lay a sharp scientific mind, one that had just reached the same conclusion he had. Time is something we don't have, he said. While we debate, that fungus keeps spreading. The creatures keep emerging. Whatever we're going to do, we need to do it now. Joseph nodded solemnly. The items for the ritual must be gathered quickly. The crystal from the highest peak, water from the sacred spring. I know where to find both. Elijah interrupted. But getting to the fissure itself, that's the real challenge. Sam closed her tablet with a decisive snap. I'm in. This is literally the discovery of the century, possibly the millennium. I'm not sitting it out. You realize this could be dangerous? Elijah asked, eyeing her skeptically. These aren't cuddly cryptids for your research papers. They've already tried to kill me once. Sam patted one of her many pockets, which clinked with what sounded like metal tools. I've tracked yetis in the Himalayas and chupacabras in Puerto Rico. I can handle myself. All eyes turned to Mike, who was still staring at the now dark tablet screen as if it might change its prediction. Finally, he sighed heavily. My job is to protect these mountains and the people who live on them, he said. If this ritual is our best shot, then I guess I'm in too. But under protest? Duly noted, Elijah said dryly. Grandmother rose from her seat with surprising grace for her age. Then it is decided. The three of you will undertake this task together. I will teach Elijah the words of binding, and our people will provide what supplies we can spare. We should leave at first light, Elijah suggested. Use the daylight to gather what we need and approach the fissure by nightfall. The creatures seemed more active after dark. They might be partially nocturnal. We could use that to our advantage. Agreed, Sam nodded. I need to collect my equipment from our vehicle anyway. I've got specialized gear that might help us: thermal imaging, sound recording devices, specimen collection kits. This isn't a scientific expedition, Elijah reminded her sharply. We're not going to catalog these things. We're going to send them back where they came from. Sam's enthusiasm dimmed slightly. Right, of course. But documenting the process is still important. For posterity, if nothing else. Posterity assumes we have a future, Mike muttered. Joseph clapped his hands once, the sound cutting through the tension. You will need rest before your journey. We have prepared places for you to sleep. Grandmother will work with Elijah tonight to teach him what he must know. Dr. Wells, Ranger Delgado, our young people will show you where you can refresh yourselves and store your equipment. As the meeting broke up, Elijah found himself alone with Grandmother near the fire. Moses had been taken to a separate building where the tribe's healer could better tend to his injuries. The old woman gestured for Elijah to sit closer. You do not trust them, she observed, nodding toward the door through which Sam and Mike had exited. Elijah sighed. The ranger's to buy the book, and the doctor she sees this whole thing as some kind of scientific breakthrough. Neither of them understands what we're really dealing with. Perhaps not, Grandmother agreed. But the mountain has called all three of you together for a reason. Each brings what the others lack. And what do they bring that I don't have? Elijah asked, unable to keep the edge from his voice. Grandmother's eyes twinkled in the firelight. The ranger brings duty, a commitment to protect others that extends beyond himself. The scientist brings curiosity, a desire to understand rather than simply fear the unknown. And you, Elijah Thorne, you bring wisdom earned through solitude and a connection to the mountain that neither of them possesses. She reached out, placing a gnarled hand on his arm. But there is something else you must understand. The ritual is not merely words and objects. It requires sacrifice. Elijah tensed. What kind of sacrifice? Not life, she assured him, but something precious nonetheless. The mountain will make its demands known when the time comes. You must be prepared to give what it asks. More cryptic warnings, Elijah muttered. Just once, I'd like a straightforward instruction manual. Grandmother chuckled, the sound like dry leaves rustling. If the path were clear, anyone could walk it. Now we must begin. The words of binding are ancient and difficult. They must be perfect when spoken. As the night deepened around them, Elijah struggled to wrap his tongue around syllables that seemed to defy human speech. Outside, the wind carried whispers from the mountain, a reminder that time was running out, and that somewhere in the darkness, the old ones continued their relentless emergence into a world that had forgotten them. In separate corners of the settlement, a skeptical ranger checked his service weapon and emergency supplies, while an excited cryptozoologist organized her equipment, both unaware that their lives had just become entangled in a story far older than human civilization itself. Dawn broke over the mountains with reluctant fingers of light that seemed to hesitate before touching the slopes of Black Peak. Elijah stood at the edge of the settlement, watching the sunrise with bloodshot eyes. He'd spent most of the night with grandmother, his tongue and mind wrestling with the ancient words of binding until they were seared into his memory. "You look like hell," came a cheerful voice behind him. Dr. Samantha Wells approached, looking frustratingly refreshed despite the early hour. She carried a backpack that clinked and rattled with equipment, and she'd traded her expedition jacket for a more practical hiking vest with even more pockets. "Feel like it too," Elijah grunted. His throat was raw from hours of practicing sounds no human mouth was meant to make. Here, Sam offered him a steaming travel mug, coffee, black as midnight and twice as strong. Ranger Mike's contribution to the mission. Elijah accepted it gratefully, taking a long sip before asking, "Where is our by-the-book friend, anyway?" Checking in with his superiors one last time, told them he's investigating reports of unusual wildlife activity with a consulting biologist. She grinned. Technically not a lie, and they bought that. He's got a spotless record, why wouldn't they? She nodded toward the bundle at Elijah's feet. "That everything you need for the ritual?" Elijah glanced down at the deerskin pouch Joseph had provided. "Still need the crystal from the peak and water from the sacred spring. We'll collect those on the way. And you really think this will work?" Sam asked, her scientific skepticism evident despite her willingness to participate. "Got a better idea?" Elijah countered. Before she could respond, Mike joined them, adjusting his ranger hat with a grimness that suggested he'd already regretted his decision several times over. "All set," he reported. "As far as my supervisor knows, we're doing routine ecological sampling. I've bought us 48 hours before they expect a check-in." "Should be enough time," Elijah said, though in truth he had no idea how long their mission would take or if they'd even survive it. Joseph and several other tribal members approached, Moses limping along beside them. The old hound looked better after a night of care, though he still favored his injured leg. "We've prepared supplies for your journey," Joseph said, handing each of them a small pack of provisions. Food, water, basic medical supplies. Elijah knelt to greet Moses, scratching behind the dog's ears. "How you doing, old friend?" "He should remain here," said the young woman who had tended to him. "His leg needs more time to heal." Elijah nodded reluctantly. "You hear that, boy? You're sitting this one out." Moses whined in protest, but settled when Elijah firmly pointed to the ground. "Stay, I'll be back for you." Grandmother approached last, her steps slow but purposeful. She carried a small leather pouch, which she pressed into Elijah's hands. Sacred tobacco, she explained. An offering to the mountain spirits. When you reach the fissure, cast a pinch to each of the 4 directions before you begin the ritual. Elijah tucked it carefully into his shirt pocket. I'll remember the words, she asked. I have them, he assured her, though his confidence in pronouncing them correctly under pressure was considerably less than total. Grandmother nodded, then surprised him by placing her weathered hands on either side of his face. The mountain chose wisely, she said softly. Return to us when it is done. With final farewells exchanged, the unlikely trio set off into the brightening day. Elijah led the way, setting a pace that balanced speed with caution. The route he'd chosen would take them first to the sacred Springer, secluded pool fed by underground waters that the tribe had revered for generations, then up to the highest accessible peak where the special crystals could be found, before circling back toward the fissure. For the first hour, they hiked in relative silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Eventually, Sam's irrepressible curiosity got the better of her. So, Elijah, she began, easily keeping pace despite her equipment load, 30 years as a hermit. What's that like? Quiet, he replied tersely. Or it was. But why? I mean, what drives someone to just check out of society like that? Elijah sighed, realizing she wasn't going to let it drop. Had my reasons, such as their personal Mike, who had been trailing slightly behind them, spoke up unexpectedly. Leave him be, Sam. Man's entitled to his privacy, says the guy who probably ran a background check on both of us, Sam retorted good-naturedly. Standard procedure, Mike muttered, not denying it. Elijah found himself almost smiling. The banter was oddly comforting, a reminder of normal human interaction that he'd largely forgotten during his years of solitude. By mid-morning, they reached the sacred spring. It lay in a small, sheltered valley, surrounded by ancient pines that creaked and whispered in the gentle breeze. The pool itself was crystal clear, fed by a spring that bubbled up from deep within the mountain. It's beautiful, Sam breathed, for once subdued by the natural majesty before them. The tribe believes these waters have healing properties, Elijah explained, kneeling at the edge. Something about the mineral content. He uncapped a small clay flask Joseph had given him and carefully filled it with the clear water. As he sealed the flask, a sound reached them, distant but unmistakable. The same resonant call Elijah had heard emerging from the fissure. A sound that seemed to bypass the ears and vibrate directly in the chest cavity. What the hell was that? Mike asked, his hand instinctively moving to the service weapon at his hip. One of the old ones, Elijah said grimly. They're getting bolder, venturing further from the fissure. We should keep moving, Sam suggested, her earlier enthusiasm tempered by the alien sound. How far to the crystal site? About 3 hours' climb, Elijah replied, securing the flask in his pack. Steeper terrain from here on out. The ascent proved challenging, especially as they climbed above the tree line, where the air grew thin and the wind picked up. Mike took the lead on this section, his ranger training evident in the way he found the safest route up the increasingly treacherous slope. There, Elijah pointed as they neared the summit. That outcropping, the crystal formation jutted from the mountainside like a cluster of transparent daggers. catching the sunlight and fracturing it into rainbow patterns across the rocks. They weren't true crystals in the geological sense, more like specialized mineral formations unique to this mountain range. Incredible, Sam murmured, already reaching for her sample collection tools. The refractive properties alone, we only need one, Elijah reminded her, and we're not here for research. With careful precision, Sam extracted a single crystal about the size of her thumb. This should do it, she said, handing it to Elijah. Perfect clarity, no inclusions. As Elijah stowed the crystal alongside the flask of water, Mike called from his position as lookout. We've got company. Below them, moving across a scree slope with unnatural speed, came 3 of the mantis lizard creatures Elijah had encountered in the mining tunnel. They moved in perfect coordination, their compound eyes fixed on the humans above. They're tracking us, Elijah realized. Somehow they know what we're doing. Options? Mike asked tersely, drawing his sidearm. Elijah scanned their surroundings. There's another way down on the far side. Steeper, but it might lose them. Lead the way, Mike nodded. I'll cover our retreat. They scrambled across the summit and began the precarious descent down the mountain's far face. The path, if it could be called, that was little more than a series of narrow ledges and near vertical drops that required as much climbing as hiking. You call this a route? Sam gasped as she clung to a rocky outcropping, the wind threatening to tear her from her perch. Didn't say it was a good one, Elijah grunted, reaching back to offer her a steadying hand. A shot rang out above them, Mike, firing at the pursuing creatures. They're still coming, he shouted. Move faster. They half climbed, half slid down the mountainside, loose rocks cascading around them. Elijah's old knees screamed in protest, but adrenaline kept him moving. Behind them, the chittering of the creatures grew louder. There, Elijah pointed to a narrow crevice in the rock face that leads to a cave system. We might lose them inside. The opening was barely wide enough for them to squeeze through one at a time. Elijah went first, then helped Sam navigate the tight passage. Mike came last, firing one final shot before ducking into the crevice, just as clawed limbs scrabbled at the entrance. Inside, the passage widened into a low-ceilinged cavern. Their ragged breathing echoed off the stone walls as they paused to recover. Think they can follow us in here? Sam asked, her voice hushed. As if in answer, the sound of claws on stone came from the entrance they'd just used. That's a yes, Mike said grimly, checking his ammunition. 4 rounds left. Elijah played his flashlight around the cavern, looking for another exit. This way, he said, spotting a tunnel leading deeper into the mountain. These caves connect to a larger system. If we can reach it, we might find another way out. They moved quickly through the tunnel, which descended at a steep angle into the mountain's heart. The air grew warmer and damper as they progressed, and a faint blue luminescence began to appear on the walls, the same fungus Elijah had seen spreading from the fissure. We're getting close to their territory, he warned. Stay alert. The tunnel eventually opened into a vast underground chamber that drew gasps from all 3 of them. The ceiling soared at least 50 feet above, covered entirely in the bioluminescent fungus that bathed everything in an eerie blue glow. Stalactites hung like frozen waterfalls, while stalagmites reached upward from the chamber floor. But it was what lay between these natural formations that truly stole their breath. Ruins, unmistakably artificial structures built of stone and some unknown material that gleamed like polished obsidian. Columns carved with intricate symbols supported arches that defied conventional architecture. Statues depicted beings that resembled the creatures they'd encountered, but with variations that suggested different castes or species. "My God," Sam whispered, her scientific mind visibly struggling to process what she was seeing. "This is impossible. A subterranean civilization. How old is this place?" "Older than human history," Elijah guessed, remembering grandmother's stories. "This must be from before the old ones were sealed away." Mike had moved to examine one of the walls, where elaborate carvings depicted what appeared to be a battle scene. "Look at this," he called. "These figures here, they look human, and they're fighting against those." He pointed to representations of the creatures they'd encountered. "The war grandmother mentioned," Elijah nodded. "When humans and the old ones fought for control of the surface world." Sam had pulled out a small camera and was documenting everything, her fear temporarily overcome by scientific fascination. "The anthropological implications alone, this rewrites everything we know about prehistoric civilization. If we survive to tell anyone about it," Mike reminded her. A sound from deeper in the ruins silenced them, all movement, deliberate and methodical. They ducked behind a fallen column, peering cautiously around its edge. Into the chamber came one of the tall, spindly beings Elijah had glimpsed directing activities around the fissure. Up close, its resemblance to a human was even more disturbing, bipedal, with a head, torso, and limbs in roughly the same configuration. But there the similarity ended. Its skin was a mottled grey-green, its head elongated and crowned with what appeared to be sensory organs rather than hair. Most unsettling were its eyes, large, black, and utterly alien, yet holding an intelligence that was unmistakable. It moved with purpose through the ruins, occasionally stopping to examine or adjust something. The blue fungus grew more densely on and around it, pulsating in rhythm with its movements. "It's maintaining this place," Sam whispered, "like a caretaker." "Or a priest," Elijah suggested, noting the reverent way the being touched certain symbols. The creature suddenly stopped, its head swiveling in their direction. It made no sound, but the fungus around it pulsed more rapidly. "It knows we're here," Elijah breathed. "Don't move." For a long, tense moment, the being remained still, its alien eyes scanning the chamber. Then, with deliberate slowness, it reached into a pouch at its side and withdrew something that glinted in the blue lighter. Device or tool of some kind. "Run," Mike hissed. Now, they bolted from their hiding place just as a beam of intense blue light struck the column where they'd been concealed. The stones sizzled and began to dissolve, eaten away by whatever energy the device projected. They sprinted through the ruins, ducking behind structures as more beams lanced through the air around them. The being pursued with surprising speed, joined now by two of the mantis lizard creatures that emerged from side passages. There, Sam pointed to a tunnel on the far side of the chamber that slopes upward. They made a desperate dash for the exit, Mike pausing to fire his remaining rounds at their pursuers. The bullets seemed to have little effect on the tall being, but one of the mantis lizards collapsed with a screech. The tunnel was narrow and steep, forcing them to scramble on all fours at times. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter as the passage became too constricted for the larger creatures to follow easily. After what seemed like hours of frantic climbing, they emerged onto a ledge overlooking a familiar side of the valley where Elijah's cabin had stood, now transformed into an alien landscape by the spreading blue fungus. "We've come full circle," Elijah realized, getting his bearings. "The fissure is just beyond that ridge." They collapsed onto the rocky ground, exhausted and shaken by their underground encounter. "What was that thing?" Mike asked, reloading his weapon with hands that trembled slightly. "One of their leaders, I'd guess," Elijah replied. "Did you see how the others deferred to it?" Sam was reviewing the footage on her camera. "The architecture down there, it wasn't just functional. It was ceremonial, religious, even." She looked up at Elijah. "I think we were in some kind of temple." "Which means the fissure isn't just an exit point," Elijah concluded. "It's sacred to them. That's why they're building around it. And why they're so determined to stop us from reaching it," Mike added grimly. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, they gazed out at the transformed valley below. The blue fungus now covered everything in sight, creating an alien landscape that pulsed with eerie light. Creatures of various sizes moved through this changed environment with purpose, continuing their work of expansion and construction. "We need to reach the fissure by nightfall," Elijah reminded them, checking the ritual components in his pack. "All of this, the crystal, the water, the words it, won't mean anything if we can't get to the nexus point." Sam studied the valley with her binoculars. "There's heavy activity around the fissure itself. Dozens of creatures, including at least 2 of those tall ones with the weapons." "We need a distraction," Mike suggested. "Something to draw them away long enough for you to perform the ritual." Elijah nodded slowly, a plan forming in his mind. "I think I know a way, but it's risky and we'll only get one chance." As he outlined his idea, the sun sank lower behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the fungus-covered valley. Soon darkness would fall, and with it would come their final descent into the heart of the Old Ones. Emerging Colonia, desperate gambit to seal away an ancient threat before it reclaimed the world that had once been its own. Darkness fell over the transformed valley like a shroud, the natural night sky competing with the eerie blue glow emanating from the fungus-covered landscape below. Elijah, Sam, and Mike huddled on their rocky outcrop, finalizing the details of their desperate plan. "The mining explosives should still be in the old equipment shed," Elijah explained, sketching a rough map in the dirt. "It's about half a mile from the fissure, here." He marked an X with a stick. "If we can set them off, it might draw enough of the creatures away for me to reach the opening." "And you're sure these explosives will still work?" Mike asked skeptically. "How long have they been sitting there?" "Dynamite gets more unstable with age, not less," Elijah replied. "Trust me, they'll work." Sam studied the crude map. "So Mike and I create the diversion while you perform the ritual." "That's the plan, unless you've memorized the ancient binding words," Elijah said dryly. "Fair point," she conceded. "But how will you get past the remaining guards? Even with a diversion, there's bound to be some creatures still protecting the fissure." Elijah patted the rifle slung across his back. I'll manage. Mike checked his reloaded sidearm. We should synchronize watches. Once the explosives are set, Sam and I will need about 10 minutes to reach a safe distance before detonation. Elijah, you should be in position by then, ready to move as soon as the diversion draws them away. They set their watches, the mundane action feeling strangely out of place against the backdrop of their otherworldly mission. As they prepared to separate, an awkward moment of hesitation passed between them, three strangers thrown together by extraordinary circumstances, possibly facing their last moments. "Well," Sam said finally, breaking the silence, "this has certainly been the most interesting field research I've ever conducted." Mike managed a tight smile. "If we survive this, drinks are on me." "I'll hold you to that, Ranger," she replied, her attempt at lightness not quite masking the fear in her eyes. Elijah, unused to farewells after decades of solitude, simply nodded. "Be careful. Those things are faster than they look." With that, they split up, Mike and Sam heading toward the old mining equipment shed, while Elijah began his circuitous approach to the fissure. The blue glow provided enough light to navigate by, though it cast everything in an alien pallor that made the familiar terrain seem like another world entirely. Elijah moved with the quiet efficiency of a lifelong hunter, using every scrap of cover the transformed landscape provided. The closer he got to the fissure, the more creatures he encountered, some resembling those he'd already seen, others so bizarre in form that his mind struggled to comprehend them. All shared that same symbiotic relationship with the blue fungus, which pulsed in patterns that seemed almost like communication. From his concealed position behind a fungus-covered boulder, Elijah could finally see the fissure itself. What had begun as a simple crack in the earth had been transformed into something like a temple entrance. The old ones had constructed elaborate structures around it, using materials that resembled the ruins he'd seen underground, part stone, part that strange obsidian-like substance. The blue fungus grew most densely here, forming patterns that were clearly deliberate rather than random growth. Guarding this transformed opening were several of the tall, spindly beings, the priest-like entities that seemed to direct the others. They carried the same energy weapons that had nearly dissolved him in the underground chamber. Surrounding them were dozens of the various creature types, moving in coordinated patterns that suggested some kind of ritual or ceremony was in progress. "Great," Elijah muttered under his breath. "Just great." He checked his watch. 5 minutes until the diversion. He used the time to prepare, removing the sacred items from his pack, the crystal from the peak, the water from the spring, the tobacco from grandmother. He rehearsed the binding words in his mind, his tongue silently forming the alien syllables. A distant boom shattered the night, the explosives detonating right on schedule. The effect on the creatures was immediate. Most of the smaller ones raced toward the sound, while several of the tall beings gestured urgently, clearly giving orders. Within moments, the area around the fissure had thinned considerably, though 2 of the priest-like entities remained with a handful of the mantis lizard creatures as guards. "Better than nothing," Elijah whispered, readying himself for the final approach. He was about to move when a new sound froze him in place, a familiar bark, followed by growling. Impossible as it seemed, Moses came limping into view at the edge of the clearing. hackles raised as he confronted one of the smaller creatures that had strayed from the group. "No," Elijah breathed in horror. "Moses, no." The old hound had somehow followed them from the indigenous settlement, tracking his master across miles of treacherous terrain despite his injured leg. Now he stood, loyal to the end, challenging creatures from another age to protect the human he loved. The mantis lizard hissed and advanced on Moses, who held his ground despite being clearly outmatched. Without thinking, Elisha raised his rifle and fired. The creature collapsed in a spray of greenish ichor, but the shot had given away his position. The remaining guards turned toward the sound, the tall beings raising their energy weapons. "Damn it all," Elijah growled, abandoning stealth for speed. "Moses, to me." The dog responded instantly, racing toward his master's voice as Elijah sprinted for the fissure. Blue energy beams sliced through the air around him, dissolving rock and fungus where they struck. One passed so close, he felt the heat of it sear his cheek. Moses reached him just as he dove behind a partially constructed column near the fissure entrance. "You stubborn old mutt," Elijah gasped, checking the dog for injuries. "Should have stayed put." Moses responded by licking his face once, then turning to growl at their approaching pursuers. Elijah knew he had seconds at most before they were surrounded. The fissure was just 20 yards away, but it might as well have been 20 miles, with the guards now converging on their position. A new explosion rocked the night knot from the direction of the mining shed, but from the opposite side of the clearing. Elijah caught a glimpse of Sam and Mike, the cryptozoologist, wielding what appeared to be homemade Molotov cocktails, while the ranger provided covering fire with his sidearm. "Go," Mike shouted across the distance. "We'll hold them off." The unexpected second diversion worked. Most of the remaining guards turned toward this new threat, leaving Elijah a narrow window of opportunity. "Stay," he commanded Moses firmly, pointing to the relative safety of their current position. This time, the dog obeyed, though his whine of protest tore at Elijah's heart. With the ritual components clutched tightly in one hand and his rifle in the other, Elijah made a desperate dash for the fissure. Energy beams sliced the air around him, one grazing his shoulder and sending white-hot pain lancing down his arm. He stumbled but kept moving, the alien syllables of the binding words already forming on his lips. He reached the edge of the fissure just as one of the tall beings emerged directly in his path. Up close, its alien features were even more disturbing, not just inhuman, but fundamentally wrong in ways his mind couldn't properly process. It raised its weapon, the tip glowing with building energy. Elijah swung his rifle like a club, catching the creature across what passed for its face. It staggered back, the energy beam discharging harmlessly into the night sky. Before it could recover, Elijah shoved past it and leaped into the fissure itself. He landed hard on a sloping surface about 15 feet down, the impact driving the breath from his lungs. The interior of the fissure was transformed even more dramatically than the outside, a vast chamber lined entirely with the pulsating blue fungus, which grew in complex, geometric patterns that hurt his eyes to look at directly. At the center of this chamber stood what could only be described as an ultra-raised platform of the obsidian-like material, inscribed with symbols similar to those he'd seen in the underground ruins. "And on this altar lay my God," Elijah whispered. It resembled a massive egg or pod, at least 6 feet tall, semi-transparent and filled with swirling blue luminescence. Within this pod, a shape was forming, something larger and more complex than any of the creatures he'd yet encountered. Something that radiated power even in its incomplete state. The Queen, he realized. This was what the Old Ones had been protecting, what all their frantic activity had been building toward. Not just colonization, but the rebirth of their ruler. A screech from above warned him he had little time. The tall being he'd struck was peering down into the fissure, already calling for others. Elijah moved quickly to the altar, setting down his ritual components with shaking hands. Following grandmother's instructions, he cast pinches of the sacred tobacco to the 4 directions, murmuring the preparatory phrases she had taught him. He placed the crystal from the peak at the base of the Queen's pod, where it began to glow with an inner light that countered the blue luminescence. Next came the water from the sacred spring, which he poured in a circle around the altar. As the water touched a strange floor, it hissed and steamed, releasing a scent like ozone that cut through the musty fungal odor. The blue patterns pulsed more rapidly, as if in distress. Elijah began the binding words, his tongue struggling with sounds no human mouth was designed to produce. Each syllable seemed to hang in the air, vibrating with power that he could feel in his bones. The blue fungus reacted violently, its pulsations becoming erratic and frenzied. The pod containing the Queen began to undulate, the shape within moving as if disturbed from deep slumber. Elijah forced himself to continue the chant, though each word now felt like swallowing broken glass. His vision blurred, blood trickling from his nose with the strain of pronouncing the alien language. Above, creatures were gathering at the edge of the fissure, their cries a cacophony of rage and alarm. One of the mantis lizards slept down, landing with predatory grace despite the drop. Elijah continued the ritual, unable to defend himself without breaking the critical sequence of words. The creature charged, mandibles spread widenly to be intercepted mid-lep by a blur of fur and teeth. Moses, ignoring his master's command to stay behind, had followed him into the fissure and now fought with desperate courage to protect him. Dog and monster rolled across the chamber floor in a tangle of limbs and snapping jaws. Elijah wanted to help, but the ritual had reached a critical point. The crystal was now floating above the altar, spinning rapidly as it absorbed the blue light from the pod. The Queen within was fully awake now, pressing against the translucent membrane of her enclosure. Through the swirling blue luminescence, Elijah caught glimpses of a form both majestic and terrifying, multiple limbs, an elongated head crowned with sensory organs, and eyes, so many eyes, all fixed on him with ancient malevolence. More creatures were descending into the chamber. From the corner of his eye, Elijah saw Moses struggling against 2 opponents now, hopelessly outnumbered but refusing to yield. The old hound's loyalty would be the death of him. Grandmother's words came back to him. The ritual requires sacrifice, something precious. With sudden clarity, Elijah understood what the mountain demanded. Without breaking the chant, he reached into his pocket and withdrew the hunting knife he'd carried for decades, the same blade that had saved him in the mining tunnel. As he approached the final words of binding, he drew the knife across his palm, letting his blood drip onto the crystal. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The crystal flared with blinding white light, absorbing the power of his sacrifice. The queen's pod began to collapse inward, the membrane shrinking around her thrashing form. Throughout the chamber, the blue fungus withered and blackened, its pulsations faltering and then ceasing entirely. A psychic scream tore through Elijah's mind, the queen's rage and anguish as she was forced back into dormancy. The tall beings fell to their knees, clutching their elongated heads in shared agony. The smaller creatures scattered in panic, including those attacking Moses. The chamber began to shake violently, rocks falling from above as the fissure itself started to seal. Elijah staggered toward Moses, scooping up the injured dog with his uninjured arm. "Time to go, old friend," he gasped, searching desperately for a way out as the chamber collapsed around them. A rope dropped from above, followed by Sam's voice. "Elijah, grab on." He looked up to see the cryptozoologist and the ranger at the edge of the closing fissure, faces strained with effort as they lowered their makeshift lifeline. With Moses tucked securely against his chest, Elijah grabbed the rope with his bloodied hand, pain shooting up his arm as they began to pull him upward. The last thing he saw before being hauled from the chamber was the queen's pod shrinking to a pinpoint of blue light, then vanishing entirely as the ancient seal reasserted itself. The old one's return to the surface world had been thwarted at least for now. As Elijah emerged into the night air, the fissure sealed behind him with a sound like thunder, leaving only a thin crack where the gaping wound in the earth had been. Around them, the transformed landscape was already beginning to revert to the blue fungus withering away, the alien structures crumbling to dust. "You did it," Sam breathed, her face streaked with dirt and what might have been tears. "You actually did it." Mike, sporting a nasty gash across his forehead, managed a weary smile. Not bad for a hermit. Elijah, cradling the whimpering Moses, looked back at the sealed fissure. "We did it," he corrected. "All of us." As dawn broke over Black Peak Mountain, the three unlikely allies and one very loyal dog began the long journey back to the indigenous settlement, leaving behind a battlefield where the oldest war on Earth had briefly reignited, only to be extinguished once more by the mountain's chosen champion. 3 weeks after the sealing of the fissure, Elijah sat on the newly constructed porch of his cabin, watching the sunset paint the western sky in hues of orange and purple. Moses dozed beside him, his injured leg nearly healed thanks to the continued care of the indigenous healer, who had insisted on checking the old hound weekly. The mountain seemed peaceful again, birds and insects creating the familiar symphony that had been his constant companion for decades. But Elijah knew the mountain would never be quite the same again, nor would he. The cabin itself was evidence of that change, built with the help of the Enmank people and, surprisingly, several volunteers from the nearby town who had heard sanitized versions of what had happened on Black Peak. The structure was similar to his original home, but with subtle improvements that reflected his evolving perspective. The windows were larger, letting in more light. The porch wrapped around 2 sides instead of just the front. Inside, a ham radio setup maintained contact with both the indigenous settlement and the ranger station. "Quite the upgrade, isn't it?" came a familiar Australian accent. Elijah turned to see Sam approaching, a backpack slung over one shoulder and her ever-present tablet in hand. Despite his initial irritation with the cryptozoologist's boundless enthusiasm, He had grown fond of her visits over the past weeks. "Didn't hear you coming," he said, which was his version of a warm greeting. "Moses is slipping in his old age." The dog in question thumped his tail lazily against the porch boards, but didn't bother to rise. "He knows I always bring treats," Sam grinned, producing a beef jerky stick from her pocket. Moses accepted the offering with dignified appreciation. "How's the research going?" Elijah asked as Sam settled into the chair beside him. After the sealing of the fissure, Sam had thrown herself into documenting everything they had witnessed, though with careful omissions to prevent treasure hunters or thrill seekers from disturbing the site. Her preliminary paper on the unique subterranean ecosystem of Black Peak had already generated significant interest in the scientific community, despite its deliberate vagueness about exact locations and the true nature of what they'd encountered. "Fascinating and frustrating in equal measure," she sighed. "I have enough material for 10 dissertations, but most of it would get me laughed out of academia if I presented it without filters. Still, the fungal samples alone are revolutionary. Nothing like them in any existing taxonomic classification." The blue fungus had mostly died off after the sealing ritual, but small patches remained in shaded areas near where the fissure had been. These remnants showed no signs of spreading and seemed to be evolving to coexist with native species rather than transforming them. "Any more dreams?" Sam asked, her tone casual but her eyes sharp with scientific curiosity. Elijah hesitated before answering. Since performing the ritual, he had experienced vivid dreams, almost nightly visions, of the world as it had been when the old ones ruled the surface. Sometimes he saw through their eyes, experiencing their alien perspective on a younger, stranger Earth. Other times, he witnessed the ancient war between their civilization and emerging humanity, the desperate final battle that had led to the original sealing. "A few," he admitted, "less intense than before. I still think it's some kind of psychic residue from the ritual," Sam mused. "A connection formed between your consciousness and theirs. Grandmother says it's the mountain's way of ensuring the knowledge isn't lost again." "Speaking of grandmother," Elijah said, changing the subject, "Joseph radioed this morning. They're holding a ceremony tomorrow to formally recognize the new guardianship. Asked if we'd attend." "Wouldn't miss it," Sam replied. "Mike's driving up from Portland for it too." Ranger Delgado had returned to his regular duties after their adventure, but with a new appreciation for the indigenous perspectives he had once dismissed. He'd become an advocate for increased cooperation between the Forest Service and the tribe, particularly regarding sacred sites within the national forest boundaries. "How's he doing with that promotion?" Elijah asked. "Still adjusting to the desk job," Sam chuckled. "Says he misses the field, but the new position lets him implement actual change in policy. Plus, the higher security clearance means he can keep certain reports about Black Peak properly classified. The official explanation for the events on the mountain had been a minor geological event, combined with the discovery of several previously unclassified species. The blue fungus was described as a non-toxic bioluminescent growth triggered by the unusual mineral content exposed during the earthquake. Most people accepted this explanation without question, eager to return to their normal lives. A few, however, knew better. "Got something for you," Sam said, reaching into her backpack. She pulled out a small wooden box, carved with intricate symbols, reminiscent of those they'd seen in the underground ruins. Grandmother asked me to deliver this. Said you'd know what to do with it. Elijah accepted the box with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. Inside, nestled on a bed of soft deerskin, lay a crystal identical to the one he'd used in the ritual, the one that had absorbed his blood sacrifice before vanishing with the Queen's pod. Where did she get this? He asked, not touching the crystal directly. It appeared at the sacred spring 3 days ago, Sam explained. Just materialized in the water, according to the young woman who found it. Grandmother says it's a sign of what? That the sealing isn't permanent. That one day, perhaps in our lifetime, perhaps in our descendants, the old ones will try to return again. Elijah closed the box carefully. And I'm supposed to keep this safe until then. Not just you, Sam said. All of us. Grandmother says the mountain has chosen new guardians, you, me, Mike, the tribe, even Moses. She scratched the old hound behind the ears, earning an appreciative groan. We're all connected to this now, whether we like it or not. Elijah gazed out at the darkening forest, considering her words. The thought of the old ones returning should have terrified him, but instead, he felt a strange sense of balance. The ritual hadn't destroyed them, it had simply restored the ancient pact, the equilibrium between two worlds that had evolved along separate paths. You know, he said slowly, I've been thinking about what we saw down there. Those ruins, the artifacts, their technology, there's knowledge in their civilization that could benefit humanity if approached carefully. Sam's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting? Not now, Elijah clarified. Not soon. But someday, when we're ready both. Species, maybe there could be communication, understanding, instead of fear and war. Elijah Thorne, the hermit philosopher, Sam teased, though her eyes reflected serious consideration of his words. Never thought I'd hear you advocating for interspecies diplomacy. Nearly dying changes a man's perspective, he shrugged. Besides, those dreams, they're not all terrible. Their world had beauty too, just different from ours. They sat in companionable silence as true darkness settled over the mountain. In the distance, a coyote called, the sound echoing across the valley. Moses lifted his head briefly, then settled back into his doze, apparently deeming the wild cousin too far away to warrant concern. I've been offered a teaching position at the university, Sam said eventually. Cryptozoological studies with an emphasis on evolutionary biology in isolated ecosystems. They're even funding a research center. Sounds impressive, Elijah nodded. When do you leave? That's the thing. She hesitated. The position starts in 3 months, but I was thinking of staying here until then. Setting up some long-term monitoring equipment, documenting the recovery of the native ecosystem as the last traces of fungus integrate or die off. She glanced at him sideways. If that wouldn't be imposing on your solitude too much. Elijah considered this. 3 months of regular human interaction after decades of self-imposed isolation. 3 months of Sam's endless questions, boundless energy, and scientific enthusiasm. There's an old trapper's cabin about a mile east of here, he said finally. Needs some work, but it's solid. Better than that tent you've been using." Sam's face lit up with a grin. "Is that a yes?" "It's not a no," Elijah replied, the ghost of a smile tugging at his own lips. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, perfect weather for the ceremony at the indigenous settlement. As Elijah prepared for the journey, packing the wooden box containing the crystal carefully in his rucksack, Moses appeared at the door with something in his mouth. "What have you got there, boy?" Elijah asked, kneeling to investigate. The dog dropped his prize at Elijah's feet, a small, perfectly formed mushroom with a cap that shimmered with the faintest hint of blue luminescence. Not the alien fungus from the fissure, but something newer hybrid, perhaps, born from the meeting of two worlds. Elijah studied it carefully, then placed it in a small specimen jar Sam had left for just such discoveries. The cryptozoologist would be ecstatic, no doubt already envisioning the paper she could write on fungal evolutionary adaptation. "Our little secret for now," he told Moses, tucking the jar into his pocket. "Let's not get her too excited before breakfast." As they set off down the trail toward the settlement, Elijah found himself reflecting on the strange path his life had taken. He had come to this mountain seeking isolation, an escape from a world that had wounded him too deeply. Instead, he had found connection to the mountain itself, to the indigenous people who had guarded its secrets for generations, to unlikely allies like Sam and Mike, and even, in some inexplicable way, to the ancient beings sealed beneath the earth. The old ones would sleep again, perhaps for centuries, perhaps only for decades. The crystal in his pack was both warning and promise, a reminder that some doors, once opened, could never be truly closed again. But that wasn't necessarily a tragedy. Sometimes, what came through those doors changed everything for the better, forcing growth and understanding where there had been only fear and isolation. A flash of movement caught his Ajar deer at the edge of the clearing, watching him with alert curiosity rather than fear. For a moment, Elijah thought he saw a faint blue shimmer in its eyes, but it was gone so quickly he couldn't be certain. The deer held his gaze for a long moment before bounding away into the forest, white tail flashing like a farewell. "The mountain has changed," he murmured to Moses, who trotted faithfully beside him, "and so have we." Ahead, the trail wound down toward the settlement, where friends both old and new awaited. Behind his cabin stood as a symbol of his past solitude and his newfound connections, and below, deep beneath the ancient rock of Black Peak Mountain, the old ones dreamed of a future where two worlds might find a way to coexist in the light of day. Elijah adjusted his pack, feeling the weight of the crystal, the weight of responsibility settle comfortably between his shoulders. For the first time in decades, he looked forward to tomorrow with something approaching hope. "Come on, boy," he said to Moses. "We've got a ceremony to attend." As they descended the trail, birds sang in the trees around them, ordinary birds, reclaiming territory that had briefly belonged to creatures from another age. The mountain was healing itself, finding a new balance. And so, Elijah realized, was he. The hermit of Black Peak Mountain wasn't quite so hermit-like anymore. And strangely enough, he was perfectly fine with that.